He did not move against the throne in his 28th year or his 30th, though the council at Emberhold argued the point more than once across that worn table in the Great Hall, and though half of them had earned, through blood and years, the right to argue anything they liked with him, he had learned, watching a mountain stir and settle without ever fully erupting, that the most dangerous forces in the world were the ones that understood the difference between pressure and eruption, and he intended the reckoning he had spent 26 years assembling to be pressure, first patient, grinding inescapable pressure for as long as pressure alone could still move the stones he needed moved. Those first years back at Emberhold, with his mother settling slowly into a life she had spent 9 years believing she would never see again, carried a strange, unfamiliar texture he found he had almost no practice recognizing the particular quality of a morning, with nothing immediately trying to kill him, nothing collapsing, no fissure to fall into, and no raider massing at the tree line. He woke, in those years, at the same hour before dawn he had woken at every morning since he was 8 years old, out of a habit 30 years deep enough that no amount of comfort had ever once loosened its hold on him. And he found himself more than once simply standing at the edge of the tide line in that gray half-light with nothing urgent left to scavenge, listening to the same waves that had once nearly starved him, and understanding slowly that the coast had not stopped being dangerous so much as it had finally, after 2 decades, stopped being the only thing standing between him and dying. His mother, in those early years after Greywatch, became something the council had not expected, and Kael himself had not fully anticipated not merely a rescued prisoner to be sheltered and healed, though she was healed, slowly, season by season, the gray in her hair never quite receding, but the tremor in her hands finally, gradually, disappearing, but a genuine architect of the work still ahead. She had spent 9 years in a fortress built to erase her, and she had spent every one of those years, she told her son over long winter evenings in the Great Hall, doing the only thing a woman stripped of everything else could still do without anyone's permission remembering. She remembered which ministers had wept the loudest at her forged letter, and which had simply nodded. Already calculating the political cost of doubt, she remembered which provincial houses had sent quiet condolences after her arrest, and which had sent nothing at all. And she remembered, with a precision that startled even Fenn's careful ledgers, the exact texture of every grudge and debt the old court had carried before it ever exiled her son. It was Isolde, more than any spy Vash's contacts could buy, who first told Kael which ministers might be turned with an appeal to old loyalty rather than new coin, and which needed to see naked self-interest before they would ever risk their own necks against a crown prince's paranoia. Sovereignty this far from the capital had never once meant peace within Emberhold's own borders, and the years of patient coalition building beyond the strait were, more than once, interrupted by problems considerably closer to home. The third of the satellite claims, a settlement called Blackreach that had grown, in the 2 decades since Fenn and Arik first mapped its seam, into a town of its own with nearly 200 souls, and a headman named Kael Draye, no relation to the throne. Though the coincidence of the name had never once stopped younger exiles from making the joke who had grown to believe, across years of relative distance from Emberhold's own council table, that a claim producing a fifth of the coast's total cindervein output deserved a fifth of its governing say, rather than the single seat every satellite settlement had held since the network's founding. Draye did not raise an army. He raised, instead, a grievance that spread through Blackreach's own taverns and pressing houses with the particular patient persistence of a genuine wrong left too long unaddressed, and by the spring of Kael's 29th year, Blackreach's output had slowed to a deliberate crawl, its ledgers arriving in Emberhold weeks late and unmistakably short. A quiet strike dressed up as ordinary seasonal inefficiency. Kael did not send Ord's militia to break it, though 2 of his younger counselors argued, in the heat of the moment, that a firm hand now would save considerably more trouble later. He sailed to Blackreach himself instead, alone but for Fenn, and sat in Kael Draye's own modest hall rather than summoning the man to Emberhold's. Because he had learned, 3 decades earlier, exactly how much a demand delivered on the petitioner's own ground could accomplish that the same demand delivered from a position of obvious power never quite managed. He listened to Draye's full grievance without interrupting it, the way he had once listened to a tied deserter's uneasy warning about a contract that smelled of politics, and found, beneath the man's genuine frustration, a complaint that was not, in fact, unreasonable that a network built to survive as a scattered handful of desperate exiles had never once revised its own governance to reflect what it had actually become. He gave Blackreach, and every satellite claim after it, 3 seats at the council table, rather than 1. Weighted by population and output in a formula, old Harlow's own successor as chief ledger keeper spent the better part of a year working out to everyone's grudging satisfaction, and Kael Draye offered the reform he had actually wanted rather than the confrontation he had half expected, became, within 2 years, one of the coalition's steadiest voices when the harder work of building alliances against the capital finally began in earnest. It was Draye, in fact, who stood at Ord's shoulder on the second day of the Battle of the Reaches years later, commanding Blackreach's own militia company at the Second Earthwork, a debt of loyalty he repaid in full, and then some. And Kael never once let himself forget, across every year that followed, that the reform had cost him nothing but the willingness to listen, and had bought him, in return, a coastline's worth of trust no amount of raw military strength could ever have purchased outright. What he built, in the years that followed his mother's rescue, was not an army in the way his council sometimes impatiently wanted it to be. It was a debt ledger written across an entire coastline of the Empire's own discontent, assembled with the same slow, unglamorous patience that had once turned raw cindervein into a fortune-won failed batch at a time. Vash's old naval contacts, embittered men passed over for promotion by officers who had never earned their commissions honestly, began quietly diverting intelligence south in exchange for nothing more than the promise that a man who kept his word about heat bricks and fair trade for 3 decades running would keep his word about them too. Fen and Eric, grown now into men whose faces carried the particular weathered calm of people who had crossed that coast in every season and survived it, cultivated something closer to a network than a rumor mill provincial governors squeezed by Aldrich's increasingly erratic tax levies, minor lords whose sons had vanished into unexplained reassignments after voicing the mildest doubt at court, guild masters in 3 port cities who had watched their trade routes strangled by a crown prince, convinced that every merchant conversation he could not personally overhear was a conspiracy against him. The work did not move without cost, and Kael made certain in every council meeting that followed a setback that no one at Emberhold was allowed to forget what those costs actually were. The first provincial house to answer Fen's careful overtures was not Vase. It belonged to a minor lord named Perrin Hask, governor of a modest fishing coast 200 miles north of the capital, a man whose own brother had been quietly executed the year before on evidence Hask suspected, correctly, had been fabricated by a crown prince who no longer needed real conspiracies to find enemies in every shadow. Hask answered too eagerly, moved too quickly, and trusted a steward in his own household who had been in Aldrich's pay for years without his knowledge, and within 4 months of his first letter reaching Emberhold, Hask himself was arrested, tried in a closed proceeding that lasted less than a day, and executed for treason before Fen's network had even confirmed the betrayal that doomed him. Kael received the news standing at the edge of the tide line, where he had once eaten mussels raw off the black rocks rather than starve, in the same place he had stood decades earlier, to receive the first second-hand word of his mother's imprisonment, and he understood, with the same cold clarity that had once told him a mislabeled mussel would kill him before he ever tasted it, exactly what Hask's death had cost the cause, and exactly what it would have cost far more broadly if the man's eagerness had been allowed to compromise anyone else. He called the council together that same week, not to grieve grief, he had told them plainly, more than once over the decades, was a private matter a leader owed no one an audience for, but to rebuild the network's discipline from the ground up. Every subsequent overture went out slower after that, vetted through at least 3 independent confirmations before a single word of alliance was ever committed to paper. And it was that harder, more patient discipline, forged in the specific grief of a good man's needless execution, that finally reached, 2 years later, the provincial governor whose family had the standing, the grievances, and the caution to make the alliance actually hold. The lesson of Hask's death did not, in the end, prevent every betrayal, because no amount of caution had ever once made Emberhold's own walls entirely proof against the kind of quiet treachery that had nearly cost the claim everything in its second year on that coast. In Kael's 31st year, a junior clerk in Fenn's own intelligence office, a capable young man named Wend Arlo, who had grown up on the claim and never once given anyone cause to doubt him, was discovered through the same patient, unglamorous cross-referencing that had once caught Ferris Duel trading whispers to an Imperial surveyor a lifetime earlier to have been passing partial reports to a merchant house with old, quiet ties to the Draye court, not out of any loyalty to Aldrich, but out of a considerably more mundane motive that Kael, questioning the young man himself in a private chamber rather than before the full council, found he understood better than he expected to. Arlo had a sister still living in the capital, sick and unable to afford the physicians her condition required, and the merchant house had offered, in exchange for small, seemingly harmless fragments of information, coin enough to keep her alive. Kael did not have him executed, and he did not exile him either, though half the council argued that a man who had sold fragments of the coalition's own security deserved considerably worse than either. He paid, instead, out of his own household's coffers rather than the settlement's shared ledger, for the sisters' continued treatment, and set Arlo to work under a considerably closer watch than he had enjoyed before, in a position where the information passing through his hands could do no further harm even if his loyalty was ever tested again. He explained his reasoning to a council that did not entirely agree with it the same way he had once explained his reasoning to Corbin and Old Harlow over the division of light and heavy labor in a camp of exiles, that a man who betrays out of desperation rather than malice is a man worth saving from the desperation itself, and that Emberhold, of all the places in that world, owed exactly that particular mercy to anyone who had ever been forced to choose between loyalty and a dying person they loved. Arlo served the network faithfully for the following 2 decades, and it was, by his own quiet account years later, the debt he spent the rest of his working life trying, in small unglamorous ways, to repay. The most valuable of these threads led, in Kael's 30th year, to Cassian Vey, lord of the wide grain coast 300 miles south of the capital, a man whose family had served the Draye throne honestly for 4 generations, and who had watched, in the last 6 years, more of his own household staff quietly disappear into Aldrich's private investigations than he had lost to 2 decades of ordinary court intrigue before it. Vey did not come to Emberhold himself a provincial governor sailing openly to a settlement the crown still officially considered a haven for exiled criminals would have signed his own death warrant, but he sent his second son, a sharp, careful young man named Ellard Vey, aboard a grain barge with a false manifest to sit across the same worn council table Kael's own people had earned their seats at, and to ask, plainly, what an alliance between a disgraced province and an exiled prince might actually look like in practice. Kael gave him an honest answer, because he had learned over 3 decades that honest answers built the kind of loyalty that a clever lie never could. He did not promise Vey a war he could not yet win. He promised him proof the sealed letter recovered from Rainer Voss's body, copied and cross-referenced now against 6 years of additional testimony from clerks and deserters, and a dozen smaller betrayals Aldrich's own paranoia had manufactured against himself. And he promised that when that proof was finally spent, it would be spent all at once, in front of enough witnesses that no minister, however frightened, would be able to soften it into silence the way they had softened Isolde's forged letter 30 years before. Vey returned south with a copy of the letter sewn into the lining of his own coat, and within a year, 4 more provincial houses had quietly added their names to a coalition that called itself in the guarded language such things always adopted. Simply the concerned governors of the southern coast, a name bland enough to survive a loyal minister's idle curiosity, and specific enough that every man who signed it knew exactly what concern it referred to. Each of the 4 houses that followed Vey's lead came to the coalition through a different door, one through a debt of old family friendship with the Veys themselves, one through the same slow accumulation of tax grievances that had first moved Vey, one through a provincial magistrate who had simply grown tired, after 3 decades of service, of watching honest rulings overturned by a paranoid court whenever they inconvenienced the throne, but every one of them, once in, found themselves bound by the same unyielding condition Kael had set for Vey's own alliance. No house moved without the coalition's collective agreement, and no house acted alone on information that had not been independently confirmed at least twice, a discipline born directly of the grief that had cost Perrin Hask his life, and that no member of the coalition, once told that story in full, ever once argued against again. Word of a growing coalition, even one that moved as carefully as Vey's, was never going to stay entirely hidden from a crown prince whose entire method of rule, by then, had become the discovery and punishment of conspiracies real and imagined in equal measure. It reached Aldrich in the spring of Kael's 32nd year, filtered through a minister too frightened of the consequences of silence to withhold it any longer, and it did to him what every previous confirmation of his brother's survival had done, only worse, because this time the threat wore the shape not of a single settlement on a forgotten coast, but of his own father's provinces turning, slowly and deliberately, away from him. He did not send mercenaries this time. He could not afford to a second failed contract, discovered and traced back to his own coffers, would have handed Vey's coalition exactly the confirmation it needed without Aldrich ever lifting a legitimate finger. Instead, he did what a cornered man with a throne's resources still finally at his disposal always eventually does: he made the war legal. He petitioned his aging, failing father for authority to launch a formal campaign of piracy suppression against what his own commissioned report described, with a straight face that fooled almost no one who read it carefully, as an unlicensed criminal fleet operating from the so-called Cinder Reaches under a self-styled warlord who had, the report noted without a trace of irony, been fraudulently claiming Imperial blood to extort tribute from honest coastal traders. Emperor Cinder Draye, 81 years old by then, and increasingly content to let his heir manage matters he no longer had the strength to examine closely, signed the authorization in considerably less than 9 minutes, because he had stopped years earlier, asking his son the kind of questions that might have cost him the comfort of not knowing. Grand Marshal Dothan Rake, who commanded the authorization, was not a man like Rainer Voss, hungry for a contract and careless of its politics. He was a career Imperial officer, 30 years in the fleet, who believed, with the particular unexamined faith of a man who has never had to examine it, that an order signed by the throne was by definition a lawful order, and he brought to the Cinder Reaches a force considerably larger and considerably more disciplined than any Emberhold had ever faced 9 warships out of the Imperial home fleet, 1,200 Marines, and a legion of 2,000 infantry landed further up the coast to close off any retreat inland. All of it moving under a banner no coalition of frightened governors could credibly claim was anything but exactly what it appeared to be. Kael received word of the fleet's departure from the capital 11 days before it reached the strait, carried by a Valorian trading captain who owed his life to a cargo of cindervein, bought fair, and delivered honest 3 winters running. And he spent every one of those 11 days doing precisely what he had spent 30 years learning to do better than any other man on that coast turning ground that looked, on any Imperial chart, like an empty stretch of forsaken coastline into a killing field that would cost an enemy considerably more than it could ever cost him to hold it. He called in every debt the settlement's decades of fair trade had ever earned. Pris Alcaine retired from the sea for 6 years, but still sharp enough to captain a blockade run, brought the Grey Widow out of her own quiet harbor one last time. Tabin Reyes' sons, who had inherited the Iron Gull along with their father's old grudges against a crown that had never once made smuggling worth the risk it demanded, joined without being asked twice. Vash, gray-haired now himself, took direct command of Emberhold's own Fleet 11 ships flying the Black Pennant and its single stylized Ember. Crewed by exiles and the sons of exiles who had never known any home but this one, and had no intention of losing it to a legion that considered their whole lives an inconvenient footnote in a piracy report. The 11 days of preparation were not spent only on walls and ships. Kael had learned, across 3 decades, of turning a dying mountain's poison into wealth. That cindervein's usefulness had never fully been exhausted, and in those frantic days before Rake's sails ever crested the horizon, he set every forge in Emberhold to a purpose the mineral had never once been asked to serve, not warmth, but fire. The idea itself was not new to him. He had turned it over, on and off, for the better part of a decade. Ever since a forge accident in his youth had briefly and violently reminded him exactly how differently cindervein dust behaved when it caught dry and fine rather than dense and packed. What he had never before had cause to perfect, he now had 11 days to master, and the work fell to the same patient, merciless trial and error that had once cost him 43 failed batches of simple heat brick, a full day lost to a mixture that flared too fast and burned itself out before a hull could properly catch. Another to a ratio that produced more smoke than flame and would have announced the fleet's approach to any half-attentive watch a mile off. A third to a batch that proved so unstable it took the ends of 2 fingers from a young forge hand named Petra Kael before Vash's own careful recalculating finally found a mixture that caught hot, caught fast, and stayed lit through open water. Ground fine enough and packed dry into sealed clay vessels, the finished compound ignited not with the slow, patient burn of a heat brick, but with a sudden, violent flare hot enough to catch pitch-soaked timber from 30 yards, and Vash, listening to his old sergeant's instinct young lord explain the idea over a hastily sketched diagram on the same worn council table. Understood immediately what 30 years of Imperial naval doctrine had never once considered, that the Empire's own charts had no entry at all for a weapon built from a mineral the maps still marked as worthless. The Battle of the Reaches, as it would come to be called in every account written afterward by men who had not fought in it, and simply the 3 days by every man and woman who had, began before dawn on the first morning, when Vash's fireship's 6 modest hulls, stripped of anything worth saving, and packed instead with clay vessels of cindervein dust wired to catch on a lit fuse, drifted, or muffled and running dark, into the anchorage where Rake's fleet had settled for the night, believing itself still a full day's sail from any contact. The men who crewed those 6 hulls were volunteers only, every one of them warned plainly by Vash himself that the fuses were timed to give a swimmer perhaps 90 seconds to clear a burning deck before the cindervein dust caught fully, and that 90 seconds in that strait's black winter water was not, by any honest reckoning, a generous margin. Every one of them made it clear regardless, dropping over the rails into water cold enough to stop a man's breath, and swimming for the dark shapes of Emberhold's own recovery boats, waiting just beyond the anchorage's edge. And it was the particular, merciless irony of that first hour that the same cold which had once nearly killed an 8-year-old boy on his very first night in exile was the thing that kept those 6 volunteers alive long enough to watch their work finish from a safe distance. 3 of the 9 Imperial warships took flame before their own watch ever raised the alarm, the fire catching with a violence no ship's carpenter aboard had ever trained to fight, climbing rigging and canvas in sheets of white-orange light that turned the whole black anchorage. For a few terrible minutes, brighter than any dawn, men went over the rails of the burning ships in numbers Kael's own lookouts, watching from the black volcanic shelf above, would later describe with a flatness that did nothing to hide how it had actually felt to witness, and by the time the sun cleared the horizon, Rake's numerical advantage had already been cut by a third without a single Emberhold sailor exchanging blows at all. It was, Kael would say decades later to a council that had by then heard the story enough times to recite it back to him, the only clean victory of the entire 3 days, and he never let himself forget how much of it had depended on an enemy's simple failure to imagine that the coastline the Empire had spent 2 centuries calling worthless might have learned to weaponize the one thing it actually possessed in abundance. What followed after that first morning was not clean. Rake, humiliated but far from broken, drew his remaining 6 warships into the narrow channel between the Widow's Tooth's black volcanic shelf and the outer reef water Emberhold's own captains had charted, tide by tide, for 30 years, and Rake's pilots had only ever seen on paper, and it was there. In a running engagement that lasted the better part of that first full day, that 2 more Imperial hulls ran aground on shoals no chart in the capital had ever accurately marked, their marines forced into the freezing surf and armor that dragged half of them under before they ever reached the black sand. The second day brought the landing Kael had known. From the moment he read the fleet's manifest off a smuggler's report, was coming regardless of how badly the first day's fires had bled Rake's numbers, because a Grand Marshal with a legion still intact on the northern approach did not need his navy hull to put 2,000 infantry ashore. They came under a bombardment from the 4 warships still seaworthy. A barrage that flattened 2 of the outer watchtowers Kael had built with his own hands as a boy, and that he had, in a small private ceremony no one in the council ever spoke of afterward, refused to let anyone rebuild in the years since, simply for the sake of leaving the scar visible. The infantry that followed the bombardment ashore came in disciplined columns, shields locked. Moving across ground Kael's own maps had walked and rewalked for 3 decades, ground that looked, to a legion trained on open fields and city walls, like nothing more than empty ash flats and dead scrub, and that concealed, beneath its gray surface, 30 years of the same patient, deadly craftsmanship that had once broken 9 raiders and later an entire mercenary company on that same stretch of coast. Ord commanded the shore defense with the same disciplined patience he had once drilled into a boy of 14 against a wrapped training post, shield lines holding at the 2nd and 3rd earthworks exactly as they had against the Iron Tide 2 decades earlier, only now backed by a militia numbering in the hundreds rather than the dozens. Drilled to a standard that would not have shamed the very legion now breaking itself against them. He walked the line himself between charges, close enough to the fighting that 2 separate officers under his command would later swear he had taken at least 1 glancing blow he never once mentioned to anyone, correcting a shield angle here, steadying a young recruit's grip on his spear there. In the same flat, unhurried voice he had once used to correct a boy's footwork against a training post that had taken the skin off both his knuckles more times than either of them had ever bothered to count. The Legion pressed the 2nd earthwork twice that morning and was thrown back twice, at a cost the shield lines felt in every gap that opened and closed along their length. Men going down and being dragged clear by the line behind them in the same disciplined rotation Ord had drilled into every militia company for 2 full decades specifically, so that no single fallen soldier would ever be allowed to open a hole the enemy could exploit. It nearly was not enough. In the worst hour of that 2nd day, with the bombardment finally lifting to let Rake's infantry press the 3rd earthwork directly, a breach opened along the militia's eastern flank, where a company of green recruits, barely a season into their own drilling, broke under a charge considerably more disciplined than anything they had faced in training. It was Eric, seasoned now into exactly the kind of steady, unshakable presence the camp had once needed Corbin to be for a frightened boy of 8, who threw his own company into the gap without waiting for orders, buying the minutes Ord needed to wheel a 2nd line into position and seal the breach before it could widen into a rout. He held that gap for the better part of an hour, and he held it long enough. But the cost of holding it was a spear wound low in his side that no field dressing in that camp could fully close, and he died 2 days later, in the same great hall where he had once sat across a worn council table, listening to Kael explain patiently exactly what a fair trade actually looked like. Fen sat with him through the worst of it, saying nothing because he had learned. From watching Kael sit with the widow Fen after her own rescue decades before, that some debts were better honored with presence than with words, and Kael carved his name into the ledger of the Reaches himself, in the same steady hand that had carved every other name the coast had ever cost him, the night after they buried him. Corbin, 60 years old and down to that same single sharp eye, directed the sling and fissure defenses that had broken the very first raid on the claim 30 years before. Still lethal, still disguised with a craftsman's patience, the Empire's own scouts never once managed to fully map, and it was his warning, shouted across a stretch of smoke-choked ground on the evening of the second day, that pulled Kael himself back from a mounted Imperial officer's blade by less than the width of 2 fingers, the same 2 fingers. Kael would note afterward, with the particular grim humor that had carried him through every worst hour of his life, that he had already paid to Rainer Voss 14 years before, as though the coast itself kept a running account of exactly what each of his victories was still owed. Kael fought in that line himself, not from any need to prove a point, but because a leader who let 3 decades of other people's children bleed in front of a wall he commanded from behind was not a thing he had ever once let himself become, whatever the cost of that principle had already carved into his own body. The third day broke the deadlock, and it broke it because Vash, watching the tide charts he had kept since his very first year on that coast, recognized a window Rake's own pilots had no way of knowing existed, a narrow channel that opened along the reef's northern edge for perhaps 2 hours at the lowest ebb of a spring tide, wide enough for Emberhold's shallower-hulled ships to slip behind the 4 remaining Imperial warships and cut them off from any retreat toward open water. The maneuver worked exactly as Vash had gambled it would, and by midday of the third day, with his fleet trapped against a shoreline his own charts insisted was impassable, and his infantry bled down by better than half against earthworks that had cost him 3 times the men he had expected to spend taking them, Grand Marshal Dothan Rake did something Rainer Voss had never lived long enough to. Consider he called for terms, standing on a stretch of black sand littered with the wreckage of both sides in equal measure, his uniform scorched, and his voice, by every account of the men who stood near him, entirely without the swagger it had carried ashore 3 days earlier. Kael met him alone at the agreed meeting point, unarmed but for the same plain knife he had carried since he was 11 years old. And Rake, studying the man he had sailed 3,000 miles to arrest as a criminal pretender, asked him bluntly whether the reports he had been given a self-styled warlord extorting honest traders had ever once borne any real resemblance to the man now standing in front of him. Kael answered him the same way he had answered every question that mattered across 3 decades on that coast, with the simple, unadorned truth, rather than a speech built to flatter it, that he was exactly who the reports claimed a discarded 8-year-old had no business becoming, and that the only lie in Aldrich's report was calling everything he had built here a crime rather than what it actually was, which was the only inheritance the Empire had ever left him any means of claiming honestly. Rake said nothing for a long moment, looking out at the wreckage of his own fleet scattered across water his own charts had assured him was safe, and then, in the flat, professional voice of a man recalculating an assumption he had never once thought to question, asked what terms Kael intended to offer a Grand Marshal who had just lost the better part of an Imperial fleet to a coastline his own report had insisted did not deserve serious defense. Kael granted him an honorable withdrawal rather than a slaughter, not from mercy alone, though there was some of that in it, but because he had learned 3 decades earlier, watching a smuggler decide whether a boy's leverage was worth calling, that a beaten enemy allowed to walk away with his dignity intact carries a different story home than a beaten enemy annihilated to the last man, and the story Kael needed carried home, more than any single tactical victory, was the story of an Imperial Grand Marshal who had personally witnessed, with his own professional eyes, that the report he had sailed south to enforce was a lie a dying emperor had signed without reading. Rake did not become an ally. He returned to the capital a broken and humiliated officer, but he returned, and he answered, when the inevitable inquiry came, with the flat, unembellished testimony of a man who had spent 30 years believing an imperial order meant something and had just discovered, at considerable cost to men under his own command, exactly how far a crown prince would bend that meaning to save his own guilty conscience. The inquiry that followed did what a decade of patient coalition building alone might never have managed on its own timeline, though it did not move quickly, and Kael, sailing north for the first time in 32 years aboard the Widow's Dew with his mother at the rail beside him, understood better than most of his own council exactly how slowly imperial justice was capable of grinding, even when the evidence in front of it was no longer in any real dispute. Vey's concerned governors of the southern coast, no longer content to remain merely concerned, presented their copies of Rainer Voss's letter to a council of ministers who could no longer pretend, with Rake's own sworn testimony sitting on the table beside it, that the document was some exile's forgery. Rake testified for the better part of a full day in a chamber packed with ministers who had spent 3 decades not asking the questions his testimony now forced them to answer, describing, in the same flat professional cadence he might have used to report a supply shortfall, exactly how a fabricated piracy report had cost the throne 4 warships and better than half a legion, and exactly whose signature had authorized it without a single independent verification of its claims. He did not spare himself in the telling, and several ministers present would later note, with a mixture of respect and discomfort neither felt fully entitled to, that a lesser officer would have spent his testimony shifting blame toward the throne that had deceived him rather than admitting, as Rake did without prompting, that a more careful commander might have questioned a report this convenient before ever sailing 3,000 miles to enforce it. When a minister loyal to what remained of Aldrich's faction pressed him, in the hearing's final hour, on whether he had any personal grievance against the crown prince that might have colored his account, Rake answered with a stillness that carried further through that chamber than any raised voice could have, that his grievance, if the minister wished to call it that, was buried on a black sand beach 3,000 miles from that table, under markers bearing the names of 400 men who had trusted in order signed by a throne they had no reason to doubt, and that he would carry that particular grievance for the rest of his own life, regardless of what the council chose to do with his testimony. It was Isolde Draye herself, restored to a public standing the crown could no longer credibly deny her, who delivered the testimony that finally closed the circle Aldrich had spent 32 years trying to keep sealed. She stood before the same council chamber that had once wept over a forged letter in her own hand, dressed not in the mourning gray the court had expected of a woman returning from 9 years' imprisonment, but in a deep, unapologetic blue that 3 separate ministers would later admit, in private correspondence, had unsettled them more than any accusation she went on to make a small, deliberate reminder that the woman standing before them had not come to beg for the restoration of a dignity they had stripped from her, but to collect a debt. She told them, in a voice fully returned to her now after 9 years spent learning to live without it, exactly how that letter had been constructed, which minister had first brought it to her husband's attention, and which of the men still seated in that chamber had known, even then, that the hand was too careful, too composed, to belong to a woman genuinely caught in the act of treason it accused her of. She did not raise her voice once across the better part of 2 hours of testimony, and Kael, seated in the gallery reserved for witnesses rather than at the council table itself, understood, watching her, exactly where he had learned the particular cold, unhurried patience that had carried him through every negotiation of his own adult life. She had been teaching it to that chamber for 2 hours before he had ever once had cause to use it against a smuggler or a mercenary captain. 3 of those ministers, confronted with her testimony and unable to explain their own decades-old silence, were stripped of their positions before the inquiry's final week. A 4th, older and more honest than the rest had ever given him credit for, rose unprompted to confirm every detail of her account and to offer, for the first time in 32 years, an apology to a woman he had watched sentenced to a tower on evidence he had privately doubted from the very first reading. He was an old man by then, his voice thin and his hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with age alone, and he addressed his apology not to the council, but directly to Isolde, across the full width of that chamber, and told her that he had spent 32 years telling himself the silence had been necessary, and that he had never once, in all that time, managed to make himself believe it. Isolde's testimony did not stop at the forged letter. She spoke, too, of a first son, Halvard, dead of a hunting accident 19 years before that no one at court had ever quite finished investigating, an accident she had quietly suspected for 2 decades and had never had the standing, imprisoned as she was. to press anyone to examine an absence from the succession that had cleared Aldric's own path to the crown as neatly as his younger brother's exile had cleared it a second time. The council did not formally charge Aldric with his elder brother's death. The evidence, worn thin by 19 years and a hunting party long since scattered or dead of old age, could not sustain a charge that heavy. But the suspicion sat in that chamber for the rest of the inquiry regardless, coloring every subsequent argument any minister still loyal to Aldric tried to make on his behalf, until even his most stubborn defenders stopped bothering to make them. Emperor Thessarian Draye did not live to see the formal reckoning concluded. He died in his sleep 3 weeks into the inquiry, 81 years old, in a palace with marble floors that had, in the end, been asked to bear the weight of exactly what it had done to his youngest son, whether or not the old man himself had ever fully let himself feel it. His physicians reported, in the small, unremarkable way such details always survived the men who witnessed them, that in his final lucid days he had asked twice after a grandchild he had never met, and a son he still, out of some stubborn, unexamined habit, referred to by a nickname no one at court had heard spoken aloud in 3 decades, a detail that reached Kael's second hand, weeks later, from a physician who had no particular reason to lie about it, and no particular reason to embellish it either, and that Kael turned over in his mind for a long time afterward, without ever quite deciding what, if anything, it was owed to change. Kael, receiving the news of the death itself in the modest townhouse the coalition had secured for him in the capital's outer district, felt neither triumph nor grief in any shape he recognized, only a strange, hollow quiet. The particular silence of a debt that had gone unpaid so long the debtor died before the reckoning could ever be delivered to his face. He had spent 3 decades imagining, in the small hours of 100 different winters, exactly what he would say to the man who signed his exile in 9 minutes. In the end, the Empire took that reckoning from him too, the way it had taken nearly everything else, and he found, standing at his own window, with the capital's rooftops spread out below him for the first time since he was 8 years old, that he did not particularly mourn the conversation he would never get to have. He attended the funeral 3 days later at the very back of the great cathedral behind ministers and provincial governors who had spent the whole of his exile pretending he did not exist, and he did not weep, and no one who watched him closely that day mistook his stillness for indifference either, because the two things, in a man who had buried this much already, had long since stopped being opposites. Aldric's final gambit, when it came, was neither clever nor patient, because the man who launched it was neither of those things anymore, whatever cold ambition had once masked the absence. With his father dead, and the throne technically his by a succession the inquiry had not yet formally overturned, he attempted, in the 3 chaotic days between the emperor's death and the council's ruling, to seize what remained of his authority, by force ordering the palace guard to arrest the ministers overseeing the inquiry, and sending in a final, desperate echo of every mistake that had brought him to this point, a single hired blade toward the townhouse, where Kael had taken temporary residence, a last, poorly considered attempt to erase the one witness whose survival made every other piece of evidence undeniable. The assassin, a quiet, competent man who had killed for coin in 3 different provinces without ever once being caught, chose the hour before dawn for his approach, the same hour Kael had spent 3 decades rising in regardless of where in the world he happened to be sleeping. A habit that had begun on a tide line scavenging for mussels and had never once left him even in a townhouse 3,000 miles from that shore. He made it as far as the servant entrance, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had done this work often enough to trust his own instincts over caution, before he found that entrance already occupied not by a sleepy household guard easily overcome, but by a militia veteran Ord had personally selected and drilled for exactly this contingency. A broad, quiet woman named Tessa Rourke, who had lost her own father to the Iron Tides raid 4 decades earlier, and had spent every year since learning, with the same patient thoroughness Ord himself had once taught a 14-year-old prince, exactly how to make certain no one else's family paid that particular price again. The exchange in the dark lasted less than a dozen seconds and ended with Rourke's blade through the assassin's ribs and her own shoulder laid open to the bone by a knife she had not seen coming quite fast enough, a wound she carried the scar of for the rest of her long life and wore, by every account of the men and women who served under her afterward, with considerably more pride than complaint. Kael had long ago stopped believing that any victory, however thorough, made the next attempt on his life impossible, and had brought a dozen of Emberhold's own to the capital specifically on that certainty. It was a certainty, that final morning, that had cost his household nothing more than a single scarred shoulder, when it might so easily have cost him everything the previous 3 decades had built. The palace guard did not follow Aldrich's order to arrest the ministers. They had watched a Grand Marshal's fleet broken on a coastline 3,000 miles from their own barracks, had heard Rake's own testimony read aloud in the officers' mess, and they chose, in the end, the same calculation every soldier on that coast had eventually made about a cause not worth dying for. They stood down, and a company of them, led by a captain who had served the Draye throne for 20 years and had watched, in growing private horror, exactly what its heir had become, arrested Aldrich in his own private chambers before dawn on the 4th day. He did not resist. Those present would say afterward that he seemed, in the moment the guard finally came for him, almost relieved, as though some part of him had been waiting 3 decades for the exact weight of everything he had done to finally, undeniably land. He asked, before they let him out, whether his brother intended to come see him personally, and the captain, who had no particular instructions on the matter and answered honestly rather than guess at a diplomacy above his station, told him he did not know. Kael did not, in fact, go to him, not out of any reluctance he could not have overcome, but because he had turned the question over during the long crossing north and had decided, somewhere in the ash and salt of that decision, that whatever he still needed to say to his brother had already been said, in full, on a black sand beach littered with the wreckage of a war Aldrich himself had made necessary, and that a private confrontation in a prison cell would serve no purpose except the small, ugly satisfaction of watching a broken man absorb one final blow he was no longer in any position to answer. He had learned 3 decades earlier exactly how little that particular satisfaction was actually worth, watching a boy of 11 decide not to kill 3 kneeling raiders simply because he could, and he saw no reason at 33 years old to relearn a lesson he had already paid for once in full. The council's final ruling stripped him of succession entirely, citing conspiracy to commit fratricide, the forging of imperial correspondence, and the unlawful imprisonment of the former empress, and confined him for the remainder of his life to a remote northern holding considerably less brutal than Greywatch, but no less permanent, under guard, with correspondence monitored and visitors forbidden, a sentence several ministers privately argued was too merciful for a man who had ordered his own brother's death twice over, and considerably more merciful than the one Kael, when finally asked directly by the council whether he wished his brother executed, chose to recommend instead. He gave his reasons plainly, in a council chamber considerably colder and less forgiving than the great hall at Emberhold, standing in front of ministers who had spent 32 years believing him dead, several of whom had signed the very writ that sent him to the Cinder Reaches as an 8-year-old boy, and were by then old men themselves, watching the child they had exiled stand taller and steadier in that chamber than any of them had managed to remain across 3 decades of guilty silence. He told them that he had spent 3 decades building something out of ash and blood specifically, so that he would never again have to accept another man's 9-minute decision as the whole of his fate, and that ruling his brother's death by the same casual calculus that had once ruled his own exile was not a victory he had any interest in claiming. It was not forgiveness. He made that distinction clear enough that no minister in that room later mistook it for softness. It was simply, he told them, the last and most complete proof he intended to offer that whatever Emberhold became, it would not become another version of the palace that had thrown him away. The throne itself, in the weeks that followed, was offered to him formally. by a council desperate for a legitimate claimant who carried Draye blood and had just demonstrated decisively both the military strength and the moral standing to hold it. The council's eldest surviving voice, a minister named Coronethal, who had sat in that chamber for 40 years and had, by his own admission during the inquiry, been one of the quieter men who had let Isolde's forged letter pass without the scrutiny it deserved, made the offer directly, standing before the same table where he had once, decades earlier, added his own signature to the writ of exile without ever once meeting the 8-year-old boy's eyes. He told Kael, with the particular careful formality of a man trying to atone for something he knew no formality could fully repair, that the empire had never needed a ruler more, and that no man alive carried a stronger claim to it, by blood or by deed, than the one now standing in front of him. Kael answered him plainly, in front of the full assembled council, because he had learned 3 decades earlier that an honest refusal delivered once, in full view of everyone with a stake in the answer, spared more trouble down the years than a private deflection ever could. He told them that he had spent 3 decades building something out of ash and salt precisely so that he would never again have to depend on any single throne's continued goodwill for his own survival, and that trading Emberhold for the very palace that had once discarded him would be, in every way that mattered, surrendering the one thing his exile had actually managed to teach him. He did not deliberate long over the refusal, because it was a question he had, in truth, already answered for himself somewhere in the ash and blood of 30 years. He did not intend to spend the remainder of his life pretending had been merely a very long detour back to the palace he was born in. He had not built Emberhold to inherit a throne. He had built it because inheriting anything from men who valued him only for what they could extract had never once in either of his lives been a thing he could trust to hold. What he asked for instead, and what the council, grateful, exhausted, and entirely without leverage to refuse him, granted within the month, was formal, permanent recognition of the Cinder Reaches as a sovereign holding independent of the Draye crown, its borders, its fleet, its trade rights, and its succession answerable to no one but its own people from that day forward, sealed by a treaty considerably more binding, and drafted by considerably more careful hands than the one that had once needed his exile to hold together for the sake of appearances. The question of who would in fact rule the Draye Empire, in the absence of both an executed heir and any surviving claimant willing to take the crown, occupied that council for the better part of another year after Kael himself had sailed home, and it was not, in the end, his to settle. A regency council, drawn from the same provincial governors whose coalition had made the whole reckoning possible, took up the throne's daily business under the nominal authority of a distant cousin of the Draye line, a quiet, unambitious man with no appetite for the kind of paranoid absolutism that had nearly cost the empire its own coastline, and the arrangement, though never elegant, held for the rest of that generation without a second civil crisis, which was, by the account of every minister who had lived through the alternative, considerably more than anyone in that chamber had dared to hope for in the darkest weeks of the inquiry. The treaty itself was signed in a modest chamber the council had chosen specifically because it was not the throne room, a small, deliberate courtesy Kael had requested, and the ministers, chastened by 3 weeks of testimony they would spend the rest of their careers trying to live down, had granted without argument. He signed his own name beneath the terms with the same steady hand that had once carved names into a flat stone on a forgotten coastline. Using an inkpot, Vash had insisted on bringing from Emberhold itself rather than accepting whatever the capital's own scribes offered. A small, stubborn insistence that the moment belong, in every particular that could still be controlled, to the coast that had actually earned it, rather than to the palace that had once tried to erase it. When the last minister's seal pressed the parchment and the Cinder Reaches became, in the full formal language of Imperial law, a sovereign holding answerable to no crown but its own, Kael did not smile. And he did not weep either, though Fen, standing just behind his shoulder in the small crowd of witnesses, would say afterward that he had watched something in the set of the man's spine finally visibly, ease, in a way he had never once seen it ease across 3 decades of watching him carry every burden that coast had handed him without ever once setting one down in front of anyone else. He sailed home to Emberhold that autumn, with his mother beside him at the rail, her voice fully returned to her now, strong enough that she spent most of the crossing telling him, in patient, careful detail, everything about his childhood that the last 32 years had stolen the chance to tell him properly, and he listened to every word of it the way he had once listened to old Harlow explain which mushrooms would not kill him, because some knowledge he had learned mattered less for its usefulness than for the simple fact that someone had finally troubled themselves to offer it. Fen stood at the rail beside them for most of that crossing too, quieter than he had been in years, and Kael did not press him to speak, because some grief he had learned from 30 years of carving names into a flat stone at dawn needed nothing from a leader except the patience to let it run its own course. The years that followed were not without their own grinding work, because nothing worth having on that coast had ever come without it, but they were, for the first time in Kael's considerably long life, work undertaken without the weight of an unpaid debt hanging over every hour of it. The treaty's ink was barely dry, in fact, before it faced its first real test, not from the Draye throne, which had neither the appetite nor the standing left to challenge terms its own council had negotiated in good faith, but from a loose confederation of pirate crews out of the Free Islands who had spent years preying quietly on Imperial shipping and saw, in a newly sovereign coastline with a young navy and an unproven border, an opportunity considerably softer than the Empire's own well-patrolled trade lanes had ever offered them. They struck first at a grain convoy bound for Blackreach in Kael's 34th year, then twice more that same season against smaller fishing towns further south along the reaches, testing, in the deliberate way such crews always tested new territory, exactly how hard the Black Pennant was actually willing to fight to defend water it had only just finished winning outright. Kael answered the third raid personally, sailing out aboard the Widow's Due herself, rebuilt twice over the decades, but still, by his own insistence, carrying her original name with Vash's successor at the fleet's head, and a squadron considerably better drilled than any single pirate confederation had ever had reason to expect from a coastline the old Imperial charts still, out of habit, marked as barely settled. The engagement that followed was neither long nor especially costly, a single decisive afternoon that sank 2 raider ships and captured a third intact, but Kael made certain its aftermath carried further than the battle itself. He had the captured crew's own captain released, unharmed, aboard a single small boat with food, water, and nothing else, and sent him back to the Free Islands with a message considerably plainer than any formal treaty language, one that every Free Island captain who heard it repeated for the rest of that generation, without needing a single word of it, explained twice, that a coast built on cindervein and blood defended its own water the same way it had always defended everything else it built, and that the Empire's old habit of marking that coastline as easy prey was a habit the sea itself would now teach any newcomer to unlearn the hard way. The captain, true to whatever grudging respect the Mercy had actually earned him, spread that message through 3 separate island ports before the season was out, and more than one Confederation crew afterward chose quieter. Reacher targets elsewhere rather than test whether the story had been exaggerated in the telling. No Confederation crew tested the Reaches' borders again within Kael's own lifetime. It was in the years that followed that particular reckoning, with the Reaches' borders no longer seriously in question by anyone with the strength to test them, that Kael finally sailed south to conclude a piece of business considerably older than the war that had won him his sovereignty at all, a formal treaty of trade and mutual recognition with the Valorian League, the very alliance whose convenience had once, 34 years earlier, cost an 8-year-old boy his father's 9 minutes of attention. The League's own ambassadors, when they finally sat across a negotiating table from him in his 36th year, carried no memory of the original treaty's cost to him at all, because the men who had drafted it were 3 decades dead, and the League itself had never once been told, in any language its own diplomats would have understood at the time. exactly what price a distant empire had paid in a single discarded child to keep that old agreement's appearance of stability intact. Kael did not raise the history with them. He negotiated the new treaty on its own considerable merit cindervein, salvaged timber, and a fleet the League's own admiralty had already quietly studied and respected long before its ambassadors ever boarded a ship south, and signed it in a hall built from stone quarried out of ground the old Imperial maps had once marked forsaken. And he found, signing his own name beneath a Valorian seal for the first time in his considerably long life, a satisfaction so quiet and so entirely without triumph in it that Sarah, watching from the gallery, told him afterward she had nearly missed the exact moment it happened at all. The wider world, in the decades that followed, learned Emberhold's name the way it learned the name of any coastline that had made itself impossible to ignore slowly, then all at once. Scholars from 3 foreign courts petitioned for leave to study the cindervein forges directly, and Kael, who had never once forgotten what it had cost him to learn those same processes alone and in the dark, granted the petitions freely, on the single condition that any scholar who came to study the mineral spend a season first working the pressing houses themselves rather than merely observing from a comfortable distance, a condition that thinned the applicants considerably and produced, among those who stayed the full season, some of the most loyal foreign friendships the Reaches would ever cultivate. Shipwrights trained in Emberhold's own yards taught a hull design Vash had spent 30 years refining specifically for that coast's brutal winter water, found themselves courted by foreign admiralties willing to pay small fortunes for the knowledge, and more than one of them returned home wealthier than any exile's grandchild had any right to expect, carrying with them, alongside their coin, a fierce and lasting loyalty to the black pennant and its single stylized ember. The satellite claims grew into proper towns of their own, linked by roads his engineers cut through ash flats that had once nearly buried a supply cart and a young woman named Dessa Tom, whose name still sat, with every other name the coast had ever cost him, on the flat stone at the edge of the original claim that men still called, without any irony left in it at all, the Ledger of the Reaches. The fleet that had broken an Imperial squadron in the Battle of the Reaches grew, over the following decade, into a navy respected and courted by trading powers 3 seas distant, and the Black Pennant with its single stylized ember became, in ports the boy who once ate raw mussels off a tide line could never have imagined visiting, a mark of a trading partner whose word, once given, had never once in 3 decades been broken. Offers came, in those years, of the kind a sovereign lord of a coastline this wealthy and this strategically placed was always going to attract marriage contracts from 3 foreign courts eager to bind a rising power to their own bloodlines, each one delivered by an envoy who spent a great deal of careful diplomatic language dancing around the same blunt question of what, exactly, an alliance with Emberhold might be worth. Kael entertained every one of them with the same patient, unhurried courtesy he had once extended to a laughing smuggler captain over a crate of dense black bricks, and accepted none of them on the terms in which they arrived, because he had learned 3 decades earlier exactly what it cost a person to be traded rather than chosen, and he had no intention of building his own household on a foundation he would not have accepted for himself. He met Sarah Halloran, granddaughter of a debtor exiled to the Reaches 2 generations before Kael's own barge ever reached that shore, not across a negotiating table, but in the middle of a genuine, unglamorous dispute she had refused, flatly and without apology, to certify a hull her own shipwrights guild had built for one of Emberhold's newer captains. A man with enough coin and enough impatience to appeal the refusal directly to Kael's own counsel rather than accept a guildmaster's judgment on her own craft. Kael, hearing both sides in a session that dragged on considerably longer than he had budgeted for it, found himself siding entirely with the woman refusing to bend her own standards for a man's impatience, and found in the weeks that followed that he had begun inventing reasons to walk down to the shipwrights' yards rather than sending Fen or a steward in his place. She did not make it easy for him, in the particular way he came, decades later. To consider the single most reliable proof that he had chosen correctly, she asked him, on their 3rd real conversation, whether he intended to court her or simply admire her work from a comfortable distance, because she had built her whole life on the coast without waiting for anyone's comfortable distance to close on its own, and she did not intend to start waiting now. He married her, eventually, in his 41st year, a woman who had run the settlement's growing shipwrights guild with a steady, exacting competence long before anyone at Court 3 Seas Away had thought to send an envoy at all. A match, the council recorded in the settlement's own ledger, not as an alliance of thrones, but simply as a fair trade honestly made, which was, by then, the only kind of trade Kael had ever fully trusted. Their daughter, Cinder Reaches Draye, named for a grandmother who had lived just long enough to hold her before the wind off the strait finally, gently, took her, grew up in a household that gave her considerably more warmth than Kael himself had ever known at her age, and considerably less ease than the council occasionally argued a sovereign's only heir ought to be entitled to. He did not send her to be raised by tutors in some sheltered wing of the growing hall. He sent her, at 8 years old, the same age, though he never once pointed this out to her directly, that a barge had once left him standing knee-deep in ash, with nothing but the clothes on his back, to spend a full season working the pressing houses at Blackreach under Kael Draye's own patient instruction, grinding raw cindervein the same slow, blistering way he once had, because he had learned, across a long and considerably harder life than he intended to hand her, that the empire he had built could not be inherited the way the palace he was born in had once tried to hand him a throne he was never permitted to actually earn. She complained about it, in the particular aggrieved way of a child who does not yet understand the shape of the gift being given her, and Sarah, watching her husband explain to their daughter exactly why her hands needed to know what the ledger's numbers actually cost before she was ever allowed to sign one, told him once, not unkindly, that he was raising the girl the way a man raises someone he expects to have to survive a shipwreck rather than someone he expects to inherit a fleet. He did not disagree with her. He simply told her, in the same flat, unhurried voice he had once used to tell a laughing smuggler captain the price of a crate of heat brick, that a fleet was only ever as safe as the shipwreck its captain had already survived, and that he intended his daughter to survive hers years before the sea ever actually demanded it of her for real. The daughter he raised that way sat her first full council session in her own right at 19, the same worn table Ellard Vey had once sat at with a false manifest, and she carried into that first session a habit her father had never once had to teach her directly because she had watched him practice it her entire life. She let the merchant across from her name his price first, and said nothing at all until he had finished, and by the time she finally spoke, the room had already begun to understand. The way Pris Alkane once had over a single burning heat brick, that the silence itself had been the opening move. She governed Blackreach's own satellite council for a decade before her father ever formally stepped back from the Reach's central seat, learning the coast the same patient, unglamorous way every generation before her had been made to learn it, and when the day finally came, well into Kael's own old age, that the Cinder Reaches needed a name to carry forward what 3 generations of exiles and their children had built, the council did not debate the choice for very long at all. The transition itself, when Kael finally consented to it, was conducted with none of the ceremony his own council occasionally argued the moment deserved. There was no coronation, no crown forged from cindervein and gold for the cameras of foreign envoys to admire. Only a single evening in the great hall, where he handed his daughter the same worn ledger old Harlow had once kept in a hand steadied by frostbite and patience, its pages long since replaced a dozen times over, but its spine by his own insistence, the very same one that had first held a decade of grinding, failed batches, and hard-won trades. He told her, in front of the full assembled council, the same thing he had told a Grand Marshal's captured messenger and a Valorian ambassador and every guildmaster who had ever sat across that table since, that the ledger did not lie, that it did not forget, and that whoever kept it honestly would never once need a crown to prove what they had actually built. He built, on the black volcanic rise above the original claim, a hall of proper quarried stone with towers that caught the dawn light the way the old smuggled maps had once described the capital's own palace catching it, though he made certain, in every particular he could control, that nothing about Emberhold's halls ever resembled that palace closely enough to let him forget, even for a season, exactly what had been built to replace it. He kept, mounted in a plain frame in his own private study rather than displayed for any visiting envoy to see, the original sealed letter bearing his brother's crest and the small, cracked shard of cindervein he had chipped from that first fissure with a sharpened rock at 8 years old, because he had learned, across a lifetime spanning 2 deaths and 1 long grinding rebirth, that a man who let himself forget exactly what a thing had cost him was a man who had already begun, quietly and without noticing, to lose it. The question of what to call him arrived. In the years after the treaty, from every direction at once, foreign envoys stumbling over titles their own courts had no established language for, provincial governors half-jokingly proposing sovereign or warden at council sessions that had otherwise nothing to do with the matter, his own daughter, once old enough to find the question genuinely funny, asking him outright one winter evening why a man who ruled a coastline 3 provinces wide still insisted on being addressed by everyone at Emberhold, from the newest exile to his own wife, simply as Kael. He told her the truth, the same truth he had given the council chamber the day he refused his father's throne, that he had spent the whole of 2 lives watching titles handed to men who had done nothing to earn them, and stripped from people who had done nothing to deserve losing them, and that he had no interest in adding his own name to that particular ledger. The wider world settled the question for him regardless. The way the wider world always eventually settles questions a stubborn man refuses to answer for himself, and it settled on the word that fit best. Spoken first by traders, and then by envoys, and finally by scholars, drafting the very treaties that bound his coastline to theirs, not king, and not warden, but emperor, offered not as a title he claimed, but as a description of a thing he had, whether he ever accepted the word for it or not, undeniably built. 10,000 men kneel now when his banner passes over the cinder road that his own engineers cut through ground the empire, once marked with a single dismissive word, and the black glass towers of Emberhold catch the dawn like a wound that never fully closes, because he has never once let it. Emperors from 3 seas away send envoys with gold and marriage contracts to sit across his council table for an hour, the same table Ellard Vey once sat at with a false manifest and an honest question, and guildmasters who would once have let a starving boy die on their doorstep rather than spare him a length of rope now send their own sons to serve in his hall, hoping the association alone will buy their houses a little more of his considerable, hard-won patience. He receives them all the same way he has received every negotiation since the day he first lit a heat brick in front of a laughing smuggler captain and watched her stop laughing with the flat, unhurried attention of a man who has never once needed anyone's approval to know exactly what he is worth. Corbin went first, in Kael's 53rd year, in the same small stone cottage above the tide line where he had lived alone since Emberhold's great hall had grown. By his own gruff insistence, too grand and too crowded for a one-eyed man who had never once in his life needed more than a single room and a clear line of sight to the water. He had outlived the eye he lost decades before by a margin no physician on that coast had ever fully explained, and he died the way he had lived, without ceremony and without complaint, found by a fisherman's boy who had brought him his morning bread the way the old man's neighbors had taken turns doing for the better part of a decade, sitting upright in his chair by the window with an expression the boy would later describe to anyone who asked as looking like a man who had simply decided he was finished waiting for something and had gone to see about it himself. Kael sat with the body through that whole night alone, the way he had once sat with the widow Fen after her own rescue, and told no one until morning, because he had learned, across a very long life, that some grief was still, even for a man who ruled 10,000 men, a private accounting that belonged to no one but the one keeping it. Vash followed him by 6 years, aboard the Widow's Due herself, on a final voyage he had insisted on making personally, though his own hands had long since grown too unsteady to hold a proper course. Dying in his sleep somewhere on the open water, he had spent the second half of his life learning to read better than any chart the Imperial Navy had ever drafted. His crew brought his body home wrapped in the same black pennant his own hands had helped design 4 decades earlier, and Kael, standing at the dock to receive it, found himself thinking, with a clarity that startled him even after everything else that coast had taught him to expect from grief, of a half-drowned man coughing seawater out of his lungs in a pressing house's borrowed warmth, asking a boy of 20 what he intended to do with a defunct naval career and a lifetime of grudges and finding 40 years later. That the answer neither of them could have fully imagined that night had turned out to be worth every year of the partnership it demanded. The widow Fen outlived them both, teaching 2 more decades of Emberhold's exiles to sew heat sacks with the same fierce, silent pride she had first brought to the work as a young woman rescued from a mercenary's hostage rope, and she died. In her own quiet season, in the sewing hall she had built with her own hands, surrounded by the 3rd generation of exiles she had trained, none of whom had ever once heard her voice, and none of whom needed to, because she had spent 60 years teaching them everything that actually mattered through the patient, exacting work of her hands alone. Kael had her buried beside Old Harlow, at her own long-standing and entirely wordless request, communicated the only way she had ever communicated anything of consequence, by simply, deliberately walking the plot beside his grave every single year on the anniversary of his death until every soul at Emberhold understood exactly where she meant to rest. He is, by the time the last of them has gone the way age eventually takes even the hardest survivors of a coast built to kill them, the sole remaining architect of everything the Cinder Reaches became. And he still visits, alone, in the hour before dawn, the ledger of the Reaches, where every name the coast ever cost him is carved in a hand that never stopped being steady. Because he has never once believed that what he built excused him from remembering, in full and exact detail, precisely what it took to build it. Sarah walks with him some mornings now, when her own hands allow it, and their daughter's children have started, in the last few years, to ask him the same question every generation of Emberhold's own has eventually worked up the courage to ask, whether the stories they have heard about a boy eating raw mussels off a tide line are actually true, or whether age and legend have simply worn the truth into something more dramatic than it ever really was. He tells them the truth is worse than the legend, every time, in exactly the same flat, unhurried voice he used to tell a laughing smuggler captain the price of a crate of heat brick, because he has never once believed that the people who came after him were owed a softened version of what it actually cost to build the ground they now stood on so comfortably. The rope, the raw shellfish, the 43 failed batches, the 2 fingers he lost to a mercenary captain's blade, the ash worked so deep into his knuckles it never washed out, none of it disappeared into the comfort his empire could now, easily, have bought him the right to forget. He kept the scars visible on purpose. Through 6 decades of physicians and healers who could easily have smoothed every mark away, because a man who lets the comfort he has built erase the memory of what it cost him is a man who has already begun, quietly and without noticing, to become exactly the kind of ruler who once signed his own exile in 9 minutes, without ever once looking him in the eye. He remembers all of it, every winter, on purpose, because a boy who refused to die twice owes the man he became nothing less than the truth of exactly how he survived to become it.